The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Buckingham Palace as Guardsman James Mitchell adjusted his famous red tunic and tall bearskin hat. He had been standing at his post for nearly 2 hours, maintaining the perfect stillness that had made the Queen's Guard legendary worldwide. Tourists gathered around him, snapping photos and making jokes, trying their best to get him to crack a smile or move even slightly. James had heard it all before. The silly voices, the dancing, the outrageous stories people told hoping for a reaction. But on this particular Tuesday morning, something different caught his attention from the corner of his eye. An elderly man, in his 80s, was slowly making his way through the crowd of tourists, leaning heavily on a wooden walking stick. The old gentleman wore a worn navy blazer with faded military medals pinned to his chest. His gray hair was neatly combed, and despite his obvious struggle with mobility, he carried himself with a dignity that spoke of years of service. The crowd of tourists seemed oblivious to the elderly veteran's presence, bumping into him as they jostled for better photo angles. James watched as the old man stumbled slightly when a teenager rushed past him without looking. The veteran caught himself on his walking stick, but James could see the pain flash across his weathered face. According to his training, James should remain completely motionless and silent. The Queen's Guard were famous for their unwavering discipline and their ability to ignore all distractions. Breaking character was strictly forbidden and could result in serious disciplinary action. These rules had been drilled into him during months of rigorous training at the Infantry Training Center. Yet something about this particular moment felt different. James had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before joining the Household Division. He understood the weight of those medals on the old man's chest, and the sacrifices they represented. He recognized the careful way the veteran moved, the telltale signs of old injuries that never quite healed properly. The elderly man slowly approached James's position, not seeking attention like the tourists, but with what appeared to be genuine respect. He stopped a respectful distance away and stood quietly for a moment, simply observing. James could sense the old soldier's presence without looking directly at him. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, the veteran spoke. "Thank you for your service, young man. I know what it means to stand guard." His words carried the weight of someone who had once stood similar watches in far more dangerous places. James felt something stir inside his chest. The old man wasn't trying to make him break character for entertainment. There was no camera ready to capture a viral moment. This was simply one soldier acknowledging another across the generations. The tourist crowd continued their antics, completely unaware of the profound moment unfolding. A group of college students were now attempting an elaborate dance routine in front of James, laughing loudly as they recorded themselves on their phones. Their noise seemed to fade into the background as James focused on the quiet dignity of the veteran standing nearby. The old man began to turn away, accepting that the guard couldn't respond. As he started his slow journey back through the crowd, James noticed him wince again. The walking stick wasn't providing enough support, and the uneven cobblestones were clearly difficult for him to navigate. James had always been taught that duty came first, that the traditions of the guard were sacred and must be preserved at all costs. His sergeant's words echoed in his mind about the importance of maintaining discipline and the reputation of the regiment. But watching this elderly veteran struggle alone while tourists ignored him felt fundamentally wrong. The decision came to James in an instant, driven by something deeper than rules and regulations. It came from a place of respect, honor, and the unspoken bond between those who had served their country. Without breaking his formal posture, James made eye contact with the old man and gave him the slightest nod of acknowledgement. The veteran's face lit up with surprise and gratitude. For a moment, his tired eyes sparkled with the recognition that his service had been seen and honored. It was a small gesture, barely noticeable to anyone watching, but it carried enormous meaning for both men. Word of what happened next would spread quickly through the ranks of the Queen's Guard, though not in the way James initially expected. Rather than facing punishment for his small breach of protocol, he found himself at the center of a conversation about what it truly meant to serve with honor. The veteran's visit had lasted only a few minutes, but its impact would resonate far beyond that single morning. As James resumed his perfectly still stance, he carried with him a renewed understanding of why he wore the uniform and what it represented to those who had served before him. The crowd of tourists eventually moved on to other attractions, their phones full of photos and videos. But they had missed the most important moment of all, a brief connection between two generations of service members that honored the true spirit of duty and respect. As the morning progressed and James prepared for the changing of the guard ceremony, he found himself thinking about the medals on the old man's chest and the stories they might tell. He wondered about the battles fought, the comrades lost, and the quiet heroism that had earned those honors. The veteran's words continued to echo in James's mind. "I know what it means to stand guard." Those simple words carried the weight of shared experience and mutual understanding between warriors separated by decades, but united by their commitment to service. 3 days after his encounter with the elderly veteran, James Mitchell found himself assigned to a different post at St. James's Palace. The incident at Buckingham Palace had been reported, as was protocol, but his commanding officers seemed more interested in understanding what had happened rather than punishing him. Captain Harrison, a veteran officer himself, had simply nodded when James explained his actions and told him to carry on with his duties. The weather had turned gray and drizzly, typical for London in autumn. Fewer tourists braved the conditions, which meant James could focus more intently on his surroundings. The rhythmic sound of rain on the pavement created a peaceful atmosphere, broken only by the occasional passing of black cabs and red buses. Around midday, James noticed a small commotion near the palace gates. An elderly woman was struggling with her umbrella, which had been turned inside out by a sudden gust of wind. She appeared to be in her 70s, wearing a simple brown coat and carrying a weathered handbag. More concerning was the way she seemed, disoriented, turning in circles as if unsure of where she was going. The few pedestrians on the street hurried past her, heads down against the rain, too focused on their own discomfort to notice her distress. James watched as she approached a young couple for help, but they simply shook their heads and continued walking, apparently not understanding her attempts to communicate in broken English. As James observed more carefully, he realized the woman was likely a tourist from Eastern Europe, based on the few words he could catch when she tried to ask for directions. She kept pointing toward the palace and then pulling out a crumpled piece of paper from her handbag, showing it to anyone who would pause long enough to look. The rain was getting heavier, and the elderly woman was becoming increasingly soaked. Her broken umbrella provided no protection, and James could see her shivering in the cold. She looked exhausted and confused, the kind of vulnerability that reminded him of his own grandmother who had passed away 2 years earlier. James's training told him to remain at his post, eyes forward, maintaining the stoic presence expected of the Queen's Guard. But his recent encounter with the veteran had awakened something in him, a deeper understanding that sometimes humanity had to come before rigid protocol. The woman stumbled slightly on the wet pavement, catching herself against a lamppost. That moment of vulnerability made James's decision for him. Without abandoning his post entirely, he caught the attention of his relief guard, who was approaching for the scheduled rotation. "Sir," James said quietly to Guardsman Peters, "there's an elderly lady who needs assistance. She appears lost and doesn't speak much English." Peters, who had heard about James's previous incident, glanced toward the struggling woman. "What do you want to do?" "Cover my position for 5 minutes. I'm going to help her find where she needs to go." Without waiting for a response, James stepped away from his post. The few tourists present looked shocked to see a Queen's Guard actually moving and speaking. Some quickly pulled out their phones to record what they assumed would be another viral moment. James approached the elderly woman carefully, not wanting to startle her. "Excuse me, madam. Do you need help?" The woman looked up at him with surprise and relief. Her eyes were red from crying and her gray hair was plastered to her head from the rain. "Please," she said in heavily accented English. "I am lost. My hotel, I cannot find." She showed him the crumpled paper, which turned out to be a confirmation for a small bed and breakfast several blocks away. The address was written in English, but James could see why she was confused. The street names in this area of London could be challenging even for native speakers. "I can help you," James said gently. "The hotel is not far, but the streets are a bit complicated." He looked around and spotted a taxi approaching. Stepping into the street, James raised his hand to hail it. The sight of a Queen's Guard in full uniform flagging down a cab was so unusual that the driver immediately pulled over. "This lady needs to get to this address," James told the driver, showing him the paper. "She doesn't speak much English." The taxi driver, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, looked at the soaked elderly woman and nodded. "No problem, mate. I'll get her there safe and sound." James helped the woman into the taxi, making sure she was settled comfortably. "Hotel," he said clearly, pointing to the address on the paper. "This man will take you there." The woman grasped his hand through the open car door. Thank you," she repeated, tears mixing with raindrops on her cheeks. "You are very kind, soldier." As the taxi pulled away, James noticed that a small crowd had gathered to watch the scene unfold. Instead of the usual attempts to make him break character, people were smiling and some were even applauding quietly. A woman with 2 young children approached him. "That was wonderful to see," she said. "My children were just asking me why the guards never help people, and now they have their answer. They do when it really matters." James returned to his post, where Peters was waiting with an understanding smile. "All sorted then?" "She's on her way to her hotel now," James replied, resuming his formal stance. But word of his actions was already spreading through social media. Several people had filmed the encounter, and unlike the usual videos mocking the guards' stoic behavior, these posts were praising James's compassion and humanity. Comments poured in from around the world, with many sharing their own stories of times when small acts of kindness had made enormous differences in their lives. Within hours, the videos had thousands of views and shares, with hashtags like Pot Compassionate Guard and Just Real Heroes trending. But more importantly, the incident was being noticed by people who understood the significance of what James had done, not just helping a lost tourist, but demonstrating that duty and compassion could work together, rather than in opposition. The story of Guardsman James Mitchell's acts of kindness had reached the highest levels of the military hierarchy within a week. Rather than facing disciplinary action, James found himself summoned to a meeting with Colonel Patricia Wynne Evans, the commanding officer of his battalion. He expected a formal reprimand, but what he encountered instead changed everything he thought he knew about military protocol and leadership. Colonel Wynne Evans was a decorated officer in her 50s, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see right through pretense. Her office walls were lined with commendations, photographs with various dignitaries, and historical artifacts from the regiment's long and distinguished history. "Guardsman Mitchell," she began, gesturing for him to sit across from her mahogany desk. "I've been reviewing the reports of your recent departures from standard protocol." James sat rigidly at attention, preparing for the worst. "Yes, ma'am. I accept full responsibility for my actions." The colonel studied him for a long moment. "Tell me, in your own words, why you chose to break character on both occasions." James chose his words carefully. "Ma'am, in both situations, I encountered individuals who had served their country or were in genuine distress. It felt wrong to ignore their need for basic human compassion in favor of maintaining an inflexible stance." "And you understood that your actions violated protocol?" "Yes, ma'am, but I believed that showing respect for a veteran and helping a lost elderly person represented the values our uniform truly stands for, even if it meant bending the rules." Colonel Wynne Evans nodded slowly. "Guardsman Mitchell, what I'm about to tell you must remain strictly confidential until I give you permission to share it. Is that understood?" "Yes, ma'am." She leaned back in her chair, her formal demeanor softening slightly. "The Queen's Guard has received over 3,000 messages in the past week. Letters, emails, social media posts, even phone calls to the palace. They're all about you and your actions." James felt his stomach drop. He assumed the public attention would bring negative consequences for the regiment. The vast majority of these messages, the colonel continued, are positive. More than positive. They're praising the Guard for showing that we're human beings capable of compassion, while still maintaining our dignity and discipline. We've had veterans writing to thank us for honoring their service, families expressing gratitude for showing their children what real heroism looks like, and people from around the world saying they now have greater respect for the British military because of what you did. James was speechless. This was not the conversation he had prepared for. Colonel Wynne Evans stood and walked to her window, looking out over the courtyard where guards were conducting their daily drills. The truth is, Mitchell, the Guard has been struggling with public perception in recent years. Too many people see us as tourist attractions rather than active military personnel. Your actions reminded the world that we're real soldiers with real hearts, not just ceremonial statues. She returned to her desk and pulled out a thick folder. I've also received something else. A request from the palace itself for a meeting with you. The palace, ma'am? It seems your story has reached some very high places. People who understand that sometimes the most powerful military action is an act of kindness. She paused, studying his reaction. But before we discuss that, I want to know if you're prepared for what comes next. I'm not sure I understand. Ma'am. Colonel Wynne Evans smiled for the first time during their conversation. Mitchell, I'm not here to punish you. I'm here to offer you an opportunity. What would you say to leading a new initiative within the Guard? One that formally recognizes that our duty extends beyond ceremonial functions to include serving as ambassadors of British values and character. James felt his world shifting. I would be honored, ma'am, but I'm just a guardsman. I don't have the experience for that kind of responsibility. Experience can be gained, Mitchell. Character cannot be taught. You've shown that you possess the judgment to know when compassion should override protocol, and the courage to act on that judgment despite potential consequences. Those are the qualities we need in our leaders. She opened the folder and showed him several documents. This initiative would involve training our guards not just in ceremonial duties, but in recognizing situations where human kindness can make a difference. It would establish guidelines for when breaking character is not only acceptable but commendable. James studied the papers, seeing detailed proposals for community outreach programs, veteran support initiatives, and protocols for assisting tourists and members of the public in distress. It was ambitious and revolutionary for an institution steeped in centuries of tradition. There would be challenges, the colonel warned. Some traditionalists within the military and government will resist changing established protocols. You would face scrutiny, criticism, and pressure to abandon this approach. Are you prepared for that? James thought about the elderly veteran, whose quiet words had started this entire chain of events. He remembered the grateful tears of the lost tourist woman and the smiles of the children who had witnessed kindness in action. Ma'am, with respect, I believe the biggest challenge would be living up to the trust you're placing in me. But yes, I'm prepared to face whatever opposition comes with doing what's right. Colonel Wynne Evans extended her hand. Then welcome to your new role, Sergeant Mitchell. Your promotion is effective immediately. James's head spun. Sergeant, ma'am? Leadership requires rank to be effective. You've already proven you have the heart for this work. Now we'll give you the authority to implement it properly. She stood, again her tone becoming more formal. Your first assignment will be developing training protocols for your fellow guards. You'll also be working directly with veteran organizations and community groups to identify ways we can better serve the public while maintaining our ceremonial duties. As James left the colonel's office, his mind raced with the possibilities and responsibilities ahead. What had started as simple moments of human compassion had evolved into something much larger, an opportunity to reshape how one of Britain's most iconic military units interacted with the world. 2 months after his promotion to sergeant, James Mitchell found himself standing in the grand ballroom of St. James's Palace, wearing his dress uniform and feeling more nervous than he had during his first day of guard duty. Today marked the official launch of the Hearts and Honor Initiative, a program that would formalize the Queen's Guard's commitment to compassionate service alongside their ceremonial duties. The ballroom was filled with an unusual mix of people: military officials, veteran representatives, tourist board members, and media personnel from around the world. At the center of it all sat the elderly veteran whose quiet words had started James's journey. Harold Pemberton, as James had learned, was an 84-year-old former Royal Navy officer who had served in the Falklands War. He had been tracked down and invited as the guest of honor for today's announcement. James approached Mr. Pemberton's wheelchair, where the old sailor was speaking quietly with other veterans about their own experiences with the Guard. The elderly man looked up and smiled when he saw James approaching. "Sergeant Mitchell," Mr. Pemberton said warmly, "I hear I have you to thank for all this fuss." "Actually, sir, I have you to thank. Your words that morning reminded me what our service really means." The old veteran's eyes twinkled with pride. "You know, young man, in all my years of service, the moments I'm most proud of aren't the battles I fought or the medals I earned. They're the times I showed kindness to someone who needed it, even when it wasn't part of my official duties." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Colonel Wynne Evans, who was accompanied by a distinguished woman in her 60s that James didn't recognize. The colonel approached with a formal expression that suggested something important was about to happen. "Sergeant Mitchell," the colonel said, "I'd like you to meet Dame Margaret Thornfield, the Queen's private secretary." James snapped to attention, suddenly understanding the significance of this meeting. Dame Margaret extended her hand with a warm smile. "Sergeant Mitchell, Her Majesty has been following your story with great interest. She wanted me to personally convey her appreciation for your service and to discuss the Hearts and Honor Initiative." "I'm honored, ma'am," James replied, still processing that his actions had reached the attention of the monarchy itself. "The Queen believes that true service extends beyond ceremony and protocol," Dame Margaret continued. "Your actions have demonstrated that our military can uphold tradition while also embodying the values of compassion and humanity that define the best of British character." She handed James an elegant envelope sealed with the royal coat of arms. "This is an invitation for you and Mr. Pemberton to attend a private audience with Her Majesty next week. She would like to personally thank you both and learn more about your vision for the future of the Guard." James felt his knees go weak. A private audience with the Queen was something most guards only dreamed of, and certainly not something that typically happened because of breaking protocol. As Dame Margaret moved on to speak with other officials, James found himself surrounded by journalists eager to interview him about the program. He had spent weeks preparing for this moment, working with media relations officers to ensure he could articulate the goals and vision clearly. "Sergeant Mitchell," asked a reporter from the BBC, "some critics have argued that allowing guards to break character undermines the dignity and tradition of the institution. How do you respond to that?" James had anticipated this question. "I believe that true dignity comes from serving with both discipline and compassion. We're not changing our core mission or abandoning our traditions. We're expanding our definition of service to include recognizing when human kindness can make a difference." A correspondent from an American network raised her hand. "Can you walk us through exactly what the Hearts and Honor protocols involve?" "Okay. New guidelines identify specific situations where guards are authorized to provide assistance while maintaining their professional bearing," James explained. "These include helping elderly or disabled individuals who are in distress, providing basic directions to lost tourists, and showing appropriate recognition for veterans and active military personnel from any nation." He continued, gaining confidence as he spoke. "We've also established partnerships with veteran organizations, local charities, and tourist assistance programs. Guards will receive training in basic first aid, conflict de-escalation, and cultural sensitivity." An elderly woman in the audience raised her hand. "I'm Mary Chen, and I represent the London Tourism Board. How do you balance these new responsibilities with your primary ceremonial duties?" "The ceremonial aspects remain our primary focus," James assured her. "These protocols only apply during natural breaks in ceremonies or when guards are stationed for extended periods. We've found that tourists actually have greater respect for guards who show humanity while maintaining their discipline." After the formal presentation, James mingled with the crowd, amazed by the diversity of people who had come to support the initiative. He met teachers who wanted to bring their students to learn about service, social workers who hoped to collaborate on community programs, and international visitors who expressed interest in similar programs in their own countries. The most moving conversation came from a group of current military personnel from various branches who had traveled to London specifically for this event. A young Army medic approached James with tears in her eyes. "Sergeant, what you've done has changed how people see all of us," she said. "For too long, people have viewed military service as something separate from civilian life. You've shown that we can be warriors and healers, protectors and helpers, all at the same time." As the evening wound down, James found himself back with Mr. Pemberton, who had been watching the proceedings with obvious satisfaction. "You know, Sergeant," the old veteran said, "when I spoke to you that morning, I was just trying to connect with a fellow service member. I never imagined it would lead to something like this." "Neither did I, sir. But maybe that's the point. Sometimes the most important actions start with simple moments of recognition between people who understand what service means." Mr. Pemberton nodded thoughtfully. "My father served in World War II, and he always told me that the best soldiers were those who never forgot they were human beings first. I think you've reminded all of us of that truth." As James looked around the ballroom one final time before leaving, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. What had started as instinctive acts of kindness had evolved into a formal program that could potentially change how military personnel interacted with the public around the world. The morning of the private audience with the Queen arrived gray and misty, typical weather for Windsor Castle in late autumn. James Mitchell had barely slept the night before, despite Colonel Wynne Evans' reassurance that royal audiences were meant to be conversations rather than formal interrogations. He stood before his mirror in his quarters, adjusting his dress uniform one final time and trying to calm his racing heart. The drive to Windsor Castle with Mr. Pemberton had been filled with nervous excitement. The elderly veteran, despite his own anticipation, had spent the journey sharing stories about his naval service and offering James advice about meeting royalty that his late wife had gleaned from her years working at the palace as a young woman. "Remember, son," Mr. Pemberton had said as their car passed through the castle gates, "she's the Queen, yes, but she's also someone who has spent her entire life in service to others. She understands what drives people like us." Now, as James walked through the corridors of Windsor Castle alongside Mr. Pemberton's wheelchair, he marveled at the centuries of history surrounding them. The walls were lined with portraits of monarchs, military leaders, and distinguished servants of the crown, each representing different eras of British service and sacrifice. Their escort, a courteous gentleman-in-waiting, led them to an elegant sitting room overlooking the castle gardens. The room was furnished with antique chairs and sofas arranged around a fireplace, creating an atmosphere more reminiscent of a comfortable family home than a formal palace. When the Queen entered, both men immediately rose to their feet, though Mr. Pemberton required assistance from his walking frame. She was smaller in person than James had expected, but her presence filled the room with an unmistakable authority and warmth. "Please, gentlemen, do sit down," she said with a smile, gesturing toward the comfortable chairs. "I've been looking forward to this meeting ever since Dame Margaret told me about your remarkable story." James found his voice, though it came out slightly hoarse with nervousness. "Your Majesty, it's an incredible honor to be here." "The honor is mine, Sergeant Mitchell. And Mr. Pemberton, I understand we have you to thank for inspiring this wonderful initiative." The elderly veteran beamed with pride. "Your Majesty, I simply spoke to a fellow service member. Sergeant Mitchell is the one who turned a moment of recognition into something that will help people for years to come." The Queen settled into her chair with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to putting others at ease. "Tell me, Sergeant Mitchell, what has surprised you most about the response to the Hearts and Honor program?" James had prepared for formal questions about protocols and procedures, but this personal inquiry caught him off guard in the best possible way. "Your Majesty, I think what has surprised me most is how hungry people are for examples of kindness in action. The response has come from all over the world, from people who just want to see that compassion and duty can work together. And they can, can't they?" the Queen replied thoughtfully. I've spent decades watching our military personnel serve with distinction, and the best among them have always understood that true strength includes knowing when to be gentle. She turned to Mr. Pemberton. I'm told you served in the Royal Navy during the Falklands conflict. Yes, Your Majesty. HMS Hermes. I was a communications officer. Those were difficult times. What kept you going during the challenging moments? Mr. Pemberton considered his answer carefully. Knowing that we were serving something larger than ourselves, Your Majesty, and knowing that our shipmates would look after each other no matter what. That's what I saw in Sergeant Mitchell that morning. Someone who understands that service means caring for the people around you. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, covering topics from the practical implementation of the new protocols to the broader philosophy of modern military service. The Queen asked detailed questions about training procedures, public response, and plans for expanding the program to other ceremonial units. What struck James most profoundly was her genuine interest in the human stories behind the initiative. She asked about specific incidents where guards had been able to help people, about the reactions of tourists and veterans, and about how the program was changing the relationship between the military and the public. I understand there has been some resistance from traditionalists, the Queen observed at one point. Yes, Your Majesty, James admitted. Some people worry that we're compromising the dignity of the Guard by allowing any deviation from strict protocol. And how do you address those concerns? James had given this question considerable thought. I try to explain that dignity comes from the character we show, not just the stillness of our stance. A guard who helps an elderly person in distress while maintaining his professionalism demonstrates more honor than one who ignores suffering in order to appear stoic. The Queen nodded approvingly. Wisdom often comes from understanding that principles must be applied with intelligence and compassion, not followed blindly. As their audience drew to a close, the Queen rose and walked to an ornate desk near the window. She returned with 2 small boxes bearing the royal seal. Mr. Pemberton, she said, presenting the first box, I would like you to accept this British Empire Medal in recognition of your service to the Royal Navy and your role in inspiring positive change in our military tradition. The elderly veteran's eyes filled with tears as he accepted the honor. Your Majesty, this is more than an old sailor could ever have hoped for. She then turned to James. Sergeant Mitchell, I am awarding you the Military Cross for exceptional leadership and for demonstrating that innovation and tradition can strengthen each other rather than work in opposition. James felt overwhelmed as he accepted the medal. The Military Cross was one of the highest honors for military personnel, typically awarded for extraordinary bravery in combat. To receive it for acts of compassion felt surreal. Your Majesty, he managed to say, I'm not sure I deserve such a high honor for simply doing what felt right. That, Sergeant Mitchell, is exactly why you deserve it. The best leaders are often those who don't seek recognition but act from genuine conviction. She smiled warmly. I expect great things from the Hearts and Honor program, and I look forward to hearing about its continued success. As they prepared to leave, the Queen offered one final observation. You know, gentlemen, throughout history, the monarchy has endured because it has been able to adapt and evolve while maintaining its core values. What you have done with the Queen's Guard demonstrates the same principle, honoring tradition by allowing it to grow and respond to the needs of the people we serve. Walking back through the castle corridors, James and Mr. Pemberton were both quiet, processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. Finally, the elderly veteran spoke. Sergeant, I think this is just the beginning. Something tells me that what started with a few words between strangers is going to change how people think about service for generations to come. 1 year later, Sergeant James Mitchell stood at the same post outside Buckingham Palace where his journey had begun. But everything had changed. The Hearts and Honor program had not only been fully implemented across all ceremonial guard units, but had become a model studied by military organizations around the world. The morning sun cast familiar shadows across the cobblestones, but the atmosphere felt different, warmer, more connected. A group of school children on an educational tour approached his position, led by their teacher and a program volunteer. Unlike the chaotic crowds of tourists from a year ago, These visitors understood they were meeting active military personnel who balanced ceremonial duties with community service. "Good morning, Sergeant Mitchell," said 8-year-old Emma, who had clearly been coached on proper etiquette. "Thank you for protecting our country and helping people." James smiled slightly, an expression now officially permitted during educational interactions. "Good morning, Emma. Thank you for visiting us today." The teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, had brought her class specifically to learn about the Hearts and Honor program after reading about it in the news. "Sergeant, could you tell the children about what it means to serve with both strength and kindness?" This was exactly the kind of interaction the program had been designed to facilitate. James knelt down to the children's eye level, maintaining his dignified bearing while making himself more approachable. "Being a Queen's Guard means we protect what's important," he explained in simple terms. "Sometimes that means standing very still and looking strong, like a statue. But sometimes it means helping someone who is lost or scared or hurt. Both kinds of protection are important." Little Tommy, who couldn't have been more than 6, raised his hand eagerly. "My grandpa was a soldier too. Would you help him if he needed it?" "Absolutely," James replied without hesitation. "Soldiers take care of each other no matter how old or young they are." As the children moved on with their tour, James spotted a familiar figure approaching through the crowd. Mr. Pemberton chuckled. "Sounds like a typical day in your new world. Any word on the international delegation?" James nodded enthusiastically. "They arrive next week. Representatives from 12 countries want to learn about implementing similar programs with their own ceremonial units. The Canadian Mounties are particularly interested, and the Swiss Guard has already started preliminary discussions about adapting our protocols." The success of Hearts and Honor had exceeded everyone's expectations. What had begun as a local initiative to humanize the Queen's Guard had sparked a global conversation about the role of military personnel in modern society. James now spent half his time consulting with other nations' military leaders, sharing training materials and helping adapt the program to different cultural contexts. "You know what makes me happiest about all this?" Mr. Pemberton said, settling onto a nearby bench that had been installed specifically for elderly visitors. "It's not the awards or the recognition. It's seeing that young guards look forward to their shifts now instead of just enduring them." This was true. The Hearts and Honor program had dramatically improved morale among the guards themselves. They no longer felt like tourist attractions or living statues, but like active participants in public service. Recruitment had increased, retention had improved, and the quality of applicants had risen, as word spread that the Queen's Guard offered meaningful work beyond ceremonial duties. James noticed a commotion near the palace gates and recognized the signs of someone in distress. A middle-aged woman was arguing with security personnel, holding what appeared to be official documents and speaking in rapid French. Her body language suggested desperation and frustration. "Excuse me for a moment, Harold," James said, and approached the situation. The woman was explaining in broken English that she was trying to deliver important legal papers related to her father's military service, but the documents were entirely in French and the security staff couldn't verify their authenticity or purpose. "Madame," James said in fluent French, a skill he had developed during his deployment years, "I can help translate if you'd like." The woman's face immediately brightened with relief. Through their conversation, James learned that her father had been a French resistance fighter during World War II, who had worked closely with British forces. She was trying to deliver documents that would help complete his application for a joint British-French commendation that had been delayed for decades due to bureaucratic complications. Within 20 minutes, James had helped translate the documents, contacted the appropriate military history office, and arranged for the woman to meet with the right officials the following day. What had been a frustrating dead end became a clear path forward. "Merci beaucoup," the woman said, tears streaming down her face. "My father is 98 years old. We thought it was too late to get recognition for his service. It's never too late to honor those who served with courage," James replied. "I hope your father receives the recognition he deserves." As the woman left with clear instructions and renewed hope, James reflected on how different this interaction would have been just 2 years ago. The old protocols would have required him to direct her to a tourist information desk with no ability to provide real assistance. When he returned to Mr. Pemberton, the elderly veteran was smiling broadly. "Every time I watch you work, I'm reminded that the best military traditions are the ones that remember we're fighting for people, not just principles." The afternoon brought James's favorite part of his new responsibilities: mentoring younger guards who were learning to implement hearts and honor protocols. Guardsman Williams, fresh from training, approached with questions about handling a situation involving homeless individuals who had been gathering near the palace gates. "The challenge," James explained to the young guard, "is balancing compassion with security requirements. We can't solve homelessness, but we can treat people with dignity while maintaining appropriate boundaries." He described the partnerships they had developed with local social services and homeless shelters, providing guards with resource cards to distribute and training them to recognize when someone needed immediate assistance versus long-term support. "Remember," James continued, "every person we encounter has a story. Some of those stories involve service to their country, mental health struggles, or simply a run of bad luck. Our job is to see the humanity in everyone while keeping the public safe." As the day progressed, James received a message that filled him with pride and anticipation. Colonel Wynne Evans wanted to meet with him about a new opportunity, leading the development of a Hearts and Honor training academy that would serve military units from around the world. "It seems your influence is expanding again," Mr. Pemberton observed when James shared the news. "From one conversation between strangers to an international movement. Sometimes I can hardly believe it myself," James admitted. "When I first stepped away from my post to help that lost tourist, I thought I might end my military career. Instead, it seems to have given my career new meaning." As the sun began to set over London, painting the palace walls in golden light, James prepared for the evening changing of the guard ceremony. This ritual remained unchanged, preserving the traditions that tourists came to see, while incorporating the values that had transformed the guards' daily interactions with the public. Mr. Pemberton rose slowly from his bench, preparing for his journey home. "Same time next week?" he asked. "Wouldn't miss it," James replied. "And Harold? Thank you for trusting me with those first words. Everything that followed started with your simple recognition of shared service." The elderly veteran paused at the palace gates and looked back at James one more time. "No, my boy. Everything that followed started with your willingness to listen and act. The words were just the beginning. What you did with them changed everything." As Mr. Pemberton disappeared into the London evening crowd, James returned to his ceremonial position. But now, instead of simply standing guard over a building, he stood as a guardian of values: strength and compassion, tradition and innovation, military discipline and human kindness. The Hearts and Honor program had proven that the most powerful way to preserve tradition was to allow it to grow in service of the people it was meant to protect. In the distance, Big Ben chimed the hour, marking another day in the ongoing story of service, kindness, and the understanding that sometimes the smallest acts of human decency can reshape institutions and inspire the world. Pemberton, now 85, was making his weekly visit to the palace, something that had become a cherished tradition. The elderly veteran moved more slowly than before, but his eyes still sparkled with the same dignity and wisdom that had first caught James's attention. "Morning, Harold," James said warmly, using the informal address that had developed between them over the months of friendship. "Morning, my boy. How are things today?" "Busy and wonderful. We had 3 schools visit this morning, 2 veteran groups yesterday, and I helped reunite a lost child with his parents about an hour ago," Mr.